and welcome to another episode of the Coffee and Podcast. We're on a quest to cultivate freedom for victims of human trafficking, all while drinking really great coffee. I'm your host, Philip Clayman. I'm also one of the co-founders of Three Tree Coffee in Statesboro, Georgia. And today we're going to be unpacking the world of coffee processing methods. We're going to be learning about the various processing methods and specifically how they affect flavor. So today's going to be more of a coffee education, diving into the world of coffee flavors and what affects that on the farm level. Let's dive on in. So today we're going to be talking about coffee processing methods. And quite simply, the coffee processing method is the process that it goes through at the farm level usually to get it out of the cherry that's on the plant and to get it into a burlap bag and ready to be shipped so that a roaster like us can roast it. And so as many of you should know at this point, if you've been paying along, walking along with us in this podcast, and obviously there's lots of other resources available to talk about this, but coffee is a plant. It's a plant that's grown all around the world, specifically near the equator. And on this plant are coffee cherries. And there's a numerous ways that the farmer can get it out of the cherry and ready for roasting. And that is what we would call the coffee processing method. Now, as we go through today's podcast, there's two important terms that we're going to be referencing throughout this whole time. And the first one is this concept of drying. Drying. When the coffee cherry is taken off the tree, it has a lot of moisture and water in that cherry, specifically usually around 45 to 55% moisture content in that cherry. And all processing methods are going to have something to do with drying and lowering that moisture content. And the goal, usually for most farmers, is to get it between 10 and 12% moisture content. Now, this is really important because this taps into quality on numerous levels. First off, if you don't dry the beans enough, and let's say the moisture content is 15%, you can actually start to grow mold. You can start to grow things you don't want and get some unpleasant flavors in your coffee because there is too much moisture left in the beans. Oppositely, if you dry it too much, let's say you dry it down to 8 or 7% before it's shipped, you lost a lot of the moisture that was already in there, which can cause it to be a little more dry and brittle, and it actually won't roast as well. We'll have to do this for an episode another time. We're not talking about roasting today, but roasting is basically the art of drying a coffee bean well. You're trying to lower that moisture content. And so if the bean comes with a low moisture content already, it's going to be difficult to roast and its shelf life will be shorter for the roaster. So the drying in the processing method is very important. And the farmer's trying to get it usually between 10 and 12% moisture content. Another topic that's going to come up, or a term that's going to come up throughout this podcast, is fermentation. Fermentation. Fermentation is just a chemical reaction in which yeast and bacteria and microorganisms will basically break down substances into other smaller or simpler substances. So in this case with coffee, the most common type of fermentation happening would be breaking down sugars into other nutrients. And this happens because of yeast and bacteria. And all coffee undergoes some form of fermentation. It may be talked about more in certain processing methods, but all coffee goes through some form of fermentation as these sugars are being broken down. So no matter what processing method we're talking about today, there's going to be some form of drying that's happening and some form of fermentation that's happening as well. Now, I would also like to, before we get into certain processing methods, talk about the anatomy of a coffee cherry. I was watching the movie Shrek with my kids recently. Classic cartoon movie for any of you who don't know. If you don't know, you maybe have been living under a rock. I don't know. It was a pretty famous movie when it first came out. But there's this movie with Shrek, and Shrek at one point turns to donkeys and he says, ogres are like onions. And he's talking about how they have lots of layers, right? Well, a coffee cherry doesn't have as many layers as an onion or an ogre, but a coffee cherry does have certain layers. And I think it's important to unpack those layers before we dive into processing because it'll help us understand the different types of processing methods better. So let's start with the outermost layer of this coffee cherry. Imagine this red coffee cherry. On the outermost layer, you have the skin. It's the outside layer, and it could, in a way, be compared to the peel of an apple. Think about an apple. There's an outside layer called the skin, right? It's very thin, but it's also pretty tough. It's a pretty tough piece, right? It's hard to kind of penetrate or crack. And so on this cherry, you have the outside skin. As we move into the cherry towards the center, the next layer you're going to find is the mucilage. This is kind of a juicy, fruity, or flesh type pulp. If you've ever had lychee, there's like a gummy, juicy sort of layer that's similar to this. Grapes are kind of similar. You got the skin, and right inside the skin, you got that kind of slimy mucilage that you can kind of squeeze and crush in your hand, and juices will come out and things like that. So in the coffee chair, you got the skin, and then you have this pretty large layer called the mucilage, and it's kind of wet and slimy. If you go further into the cherry, the next layer you're going to find is called the parchment. The parchment. And once drying is done in any of the processing methods, this will kind of be a thin, brittle type of shell that's over the bean. It's kind of like a peanut husk. When you crack open the shell on the inside, there's kind of like that papery, brittle peanut papery thing. That's kind of what the parchment is. Parchment with coffee is going to be a little thicker and tougher than that peanut example. But that's the next layer you're going to find. So skin on the outside, mucilage is the next layer in, and it's a pretty thick layer. Then you've got this parchment layer that's kind of brittle and thin. And then within that, over the bean, you have something called the silver skin. And the silver skin is what comes off during roasting and becomes chaff. If you've ever seen coffee roasting, you've probably seen chaff. The silver skin is what becomes the chaff. And the silver skin is not taken off during any of the processing methods. As we're talking about coffee processing, we're talking about the skin, the mucilage, and the parchment. The silver skin is usually left on and it comes off during the roasting process. So those are the different layers of a coffee cherry. And as we go through that, we're going to be referencing that throughout this podcast to really understand what's happening during the processing methods. So now let's dive right in. Processing methods. The farmer picks the cherry. The next thing they do is called the wet milling process. We're going to have wet milling and dry milling. These are the two components of processing methods. Wet milling, then dry milling. And so in the wet milling process, the farmer is basically dealing with the skin and the mucilage. What do they do with the skin and the mucilage to dry and ferment the coffee? That's what's happening in the wet milling stage. And there's two very common forms of wet milling. And you've probably heard these terms before. They're very common in the coffee world. People may not always know exactly what they mean, but they are buzzwords. They're well known. And those two wet milling processes are called washed, or the wet process, washed or wet. And the other one's called natural, or the dry process. So let's unpack both of these. The farmer takes the cherry off the plant. In the washed process, or the wet process, the farmer will remove the skin and the mucilage. They'll actually depulp it, they'll get that skin off, and then they'll wash off the mucilage in water tanks. And they actually use the water for fermentation, but they do all this before drying. So the cherry's taken off the plant, the the skin and the mucilage is removed so that it can then dry to the proper moisture content of 10 to 12%. These types of coffees processed in this way, the wash process, will produce some cleaner, brighter flavors that are usually maybe have more acidity, more brightness. That's some of the more common flavor profiles that will come through. You can also get some nice sweetness from them, but they're definitely going to be brighter and more acidic with the washed process. Now, the other most common way that the farmer will take the coffee through the wet milling process is called the natural process, or the dry process. In this example, the farmer takes the whole cherry in all of its layers, skin, mucilage, parchment, all of it's still there, and dry it in the sun. And it will dry and ferment all together. And the end result is a cup that is really heavy with juicy, fruity flavors. Because of that intentional fermentation, it'll usually taste really intense and fruity. And sometimes And I say not with great quality. I don't prefer this in a cup of coffee, but it'll sometimes even taste fermenty. I mean, kind of like winey and just really almost too intense with that alcohol sort of flavor. And so we're talking about the wet milling process and what the farmer does to get it out of the plant. And basically, what do they do with this cherry? Well, the wash process is they remove the skin and the mucilage and then dry it. Whereas with the natural process, the farmer would leave it all intact to dry and then remove the skin and the mucilage. And they produce different flavors. Natural process can sometimes be a confusing word. I've had some customers before ask me, does natural mean that it's organic or that it's better for you? No, usually if you see natural process or the word natural on a bag of coffee, they're usually talking about the processing method, meaning that coffee was dried in the cherry, which created some unique flavors that'll usually be more fruity and dense. So those are the two most common forms of wet milling, washed and dry process. But there's another one in between. It's called aptly named the semi-washed, right? Sort of washed. Another word for it would be the honey process. And this is basically just in the middle, right? If one side of the spectrum is washed coffees where pretty much everything is removed, the skin and all the mucilage before it's dried. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have natural where it's all dried together. This is somewhere in the middle. Honey process is where you take off the outside skin, but you leave that mucilage. So you're kind of getting some fermentation like natural processed, but it's not full on fermentation like natural process. So you kind of get the best of both worlds if done properly. You'll get some nice bright acidity along with some nice juicy, dense fruit flavors. Our at Three Tree Coffee, our Honduras Copon coffee, it's got a yellow label. So it is a black honey processed, and black honey just means a certain amount of mucilage was removed. Actually, very little mucilage was removed specifically. And sometimes honey processed will be categorized by a color, and it's the color that it looks like as it's drying. And so our black honey processed Honduras is fantastic. It is one of my favorite coffees right now. It's a really balanced cup of coffee. And one of the reasons is because I believe it was fermented really well in this semi-washed way. So shout out to Finca Terrorito. Way to go. Awesome black honey processed Honduras coffee. So those are some of the common ways of wet milling the coffee. Basically, the farmer getting it out of the plant, getting the cherry off the plant, and then removing the skin and the mucilage. There's a big trend in the specialty coffee world right now that's all about experimental processes. And it's kind of a big umbrella term to talk about a lot of different things. We actually have an episode 19. It's a 3 by 3 by 3. So three people drinking three coffees in 3 minutes, where we have experimental coffees on the table. And so we talk about experimental coffees a little bit. Go check out episode 19 if you haven't watched that one yet. Experimental processes is kind of an umbrella term for really doing lots of different things when it comes to fermentation and drying in the wet milling phase. So I just want to share a couple of examples of this because it can really look different in a lot of different settings. One type of experimental process that I've seen before and I've had quite frequently is called co-ferment. Co-ferment. And as it sounds, it means that you're adding something else with the coffee to ferment with it. And it's usually fruits or something like that. And so let's see, I had a really great co-ferment coffee from Black and White Coffee Roasters. It was a strawberry co-ferment. So during the drying and fermentation phase, they actually added dried strawberries to impart some of those flavors onto the beans. Another type of experimental process is called anaerobic fermentation. This is probably the most popular one. Anaerobic just means without oxygen. And so basically, while the coffee is going through its drying and fermentation stage, they remove all the oxygen. The farmer puts it in tanks, removes all the oxygen. So it's an oxygen-free environment, which will allow just different chemical reactions to occur and affect the flavor. So there's anaerobic fermentation. Another one that we had on, I think it was a podcast a while back, forgive me, I can't remember the exact episode, but a carbonic maceration coffee. This came from Corvus Coffee, and carbonic maceration just means that as you remove oxygen from these tanks, you infuse it with carbon gas, which is going to, of course, affect flavor. As the coffee ferments in a carbon-rich environment, it will produce some different flavors. And then the other common thing I've seen with experimental processes is basically using fed cultures or uniquely crafted cultures with during the drying and the fermentation phase. And so an example of this is a koji fungus, Koji fungus. This is a Japanese fungus that's used to make sake. And it's been a big push in the coffee world lately to let these coffee cherries ferment and dry in chambers of koji fungus, and it produces just some wild, crazy flavors, right? This fungus helps with the fermentation process and imparts some unique flavors. This is another type of experimental process, creating unique cultures that you then dry and ferment the cherries in. So experimental processing is kind of a wild, wild west of coffee right now. There's some crazy flavors out there. We've had some wild coffees that were experimental processed. We actually have an experimental processed coffee coming later on in the fall at Three Trees, so super excited about that. But it's also posed a little bit of a controversy in the coffee world because you're kind of manipulating flavor, and you have sort of this purist ideology of we should just taste the coffee as it is in its pure form, and you have another side of the camp saying, well, these are some wild, exciting, fun flavors. And if it tastes good, it is good, is one roaster's tagline that they use when it comes to experimental processed coffees. And usually these experimental processed coffees will fetch a really high price for the farmer. They're expensive. The farmer can charge a high price. And so there's a lot of people saying, who are we to withhold that right from a farmer? If they can fetch a better price, go fetch a better price. So what that they're drying it with strawberries and that's imparting a strawberry flavor. So it's been really fascinating seeing some of the debates within specialty coffee. And, I would say I land somewhere in the middle. I've had some experimental processed coffees that are fantastic and I really enjoy them. At the same time, as we think about competitions and coffee competitions, we maybe need to be aware of how much was this coffee influenced in flavor before it was being judged. As an example, let's say I bring a coffee to a competition and I pump caramel syrup into it, and suddenly it tastes like caramel. Well, clearly that wouldn't be fair from competition standards. It would taste incredibly sweet. It would taste very strange and very different from just a black cup of coffee. And I'm influencing the flavor. And I don't know if maybe we should be competing with with those sorts of coffees. So it's a big debate right now. I'm pretty open. If other people have thoughts on it, I'm happy to hear your thoughts as well. But experimental process is a big debate right now. Nonetheless, you can't deny it produces some really fun, funky, wild flavors because you are affecting the drying and the fermentation during the wet milling process. Now, so far, we have only addressed the skin and the mucilage. We've not touched the parchment yet, and that's what we're about to get to. So, once the farmer has picked the cherry and has gone through some wet milling process, maybe it was a natural process, dried in the cherry, maybe it was a wash process, but they've gotten it down to the parchment and the correct moisture content, 10 to 12%. Well, the farmer usually then sends it off to a dry mill. The dry milling usually does not happen on the farm. Sometimes it does. It depends on the size of the farm. But normally you'll have these large dry milling complexes or warehouses that receive coffees from lots of different farmers that have already been through the wet milling process. But it's at this dry mill that they will finish the processing. And there's a couple goals with the dry milling. One of the goals is to remove impurities. There may be some stones in these bags of coffee. There may be corn kernels. Some of the beans may have gotten crushed at various points. So during the dry milling, you're normally trying to remove impurities or beans that are not the best quality. At the dry mill, this is where the parchment is removed. Remember that husky kind of brittle layer I mentioned? The parchment is removed, and this is called hulling. You're hulling the coffee parchments or the husks off the beans, and they use these big machines usually to do this. Although I've actually been to a farm where it wasn't a big machine; it was a very small machine that just kind of rubbed the cherries together to break off that papery substance, and then a blower just blew all that parchment off to the side. Nonetheless, during the dry milling, that parchment's got to come off. Then at the dry mill, another goal would be to sort the beans by size, color, and or density. This is an incredibly important part of the dry milling process. Let's say there's a coffee cherry that's really small and a coffee bean, I should say, Let's say there's a coffee bean that's really small and then another coffee bean that's really large. Well, these are going to roast very differently because of the density of those beans. Maybe their moisture contents are different because they didn't dry the same. And because they roast different, you're going to get a really inconsistent flavor and an inconsistent roast to roast um, coffee. And so the dry milling usually sorts these coffees into various sizes, certain colors, and certain densities just to make sure that there's consistency for the roaster. The last goal of the dry milling process is to prepare the coffee for exporting. So the coffee is bagged up properly in these burlap bags, hopefully in an eco-tact plastic bag inside. So that way it really is preserving that moisture. More on that maybe in another episode. And it's being then shipped off. I remember visiting the dry mill, a dry mill in Chiapas, Mexico, and it's a large warehouse with lots of machinery going on. In one area, you had this really gigantic slanted table that just shook rapidly, and it was very loud. This table's shaking rapidly, and it's slanted at an angle. And what that machine is doing is it's actually sorting the beans by size and density. The heavier beans will more quickly fall down the table to the lower part. The lighter beans will stay up towards the top more quickly or more easily. And so you can sort the beans in that way. Also, at this dry mill, they had an optical sorter. So all these beans are falling through this machine. It kind of looks like a waterfall of coffee beans. And there's these cameras that are watching all these beans. And if they see a bean that doesn't look like it's going to be good quality, maybe it's got a crack in it or it's super small, or maybe it's a piece of a rock or something, it'll actually shoot some water or something really quickly to basically knock that one bean out of the rest of them. Pretty amazing machinery. And so there's just lots happening at the dry mill. And there's really not much at the dry mill that will impart flavor. If you go back to the wet milling at the farm, a lot of that can impart flavor. Natural process will create denser, fruity flavors. Wash process will create brighter, more acidic flavors. At the dry milling, you're really not doing much that's imparting any sort of flavor, but it's incredibly important for preserving the peak, high quality potential flavor of a coffee. Um, so let's say some impurities were left in there. That would affect the final cup of coffee. Let's say that the beans are not packaged well for shipping. Well, they may taste really bad by the time they get to the port. If you haven't listened to episode 18 with Joey Cizzoni with Cafe Creole, go check it out. Episode 18, we talk a lot about the logistics of shipping coffee from one country to another and all that can happen along that journey to ruin a cup of coffee. You can lose all this flavor potential. Even if everything was done right at the farm and everything was done right at the roaster, you can still not have a great cup of coffee simply because it was not packaged, stored, and shipped well. But the dry mill is responsible for a lot of this to make sure that a coffee stays at its peak performance and peak optimum flavor. Well, that does it for today's episode. We talked about the coffee processing methods, both the wet milling and the dry milling, and how that affects the different layers of the coffee cherry through drying and fermentation. There's really not a ton to it, but when you see it in person, it definitely helps you understand it, which is why I wanted to share some more with you about it. To recap the flavors, because once again, you may see this on coffee bags and shelves in various places. If you see natural processed or dry processed, that usually means it's going to have more dense, fruity flavors. And if you see the word washed on there or washed process, wet process, it's probably going to be more bright, acidic flavors. I hope this was helpful for you. If it was, I ask that you please leave us a review. Give us a good review to let other people know that you're enjoying this podcast. Not only do we talk about coffee education, but we also bring other people on that are in the anti-trafficking movement and in that space. And so, on that note, next week we actually have Bryn with Blue Bear Coffee coming on the show. He's coming to us from the UK to talk with us about using coffee to end human trafficking. Sound familiar? It should. Tune in next week to hear a riveting conversation about how he went from policing to coffee for a cause. An awesome interview, and I think you're going to love it. Until then, I'm your host, Philip Clayman. Thank you for helping us cultivate freedom.